By the summer of 1940, the most powerful war machine the modern world had ever assembled was standing on the edge of the English Channel looking across 21 miles of water at the last country in Western Europe that had not yet surrendered or been destroyed. Nazi Germany had done in 6 weeks what the Kaiser's armies had failed to do in 4 years. France was gone. Belgium was gone. Holland was gone. Denmark and Norway were gone. Poland was gone. The continent of Europe, from the Atlantic coast to the Soviet border, was either occupied, allied with Berlin, or too terrified to resist. And across that narrow strip of gray water, on an island that had no army left worth the name, with a civilian population that had never been bombed and had no idea what was coming, with a new prime minister who had been in the job for less than 3 months, Britain stood alone, completely alone, against a force that had just demonstrated, with appalling efficiency, that it could defeat any army placed in front of it. The strategists in Berlin looked at the numbers and made the only logical calculation available. Britain should sue for peace. Britain should negotiate. Britain should accept the reality of what had happened and settle for whatever terms Germany was prepared to offer before those terms got worse. The strategists were not wrong about the numbers. They were catastrophically wrong about one thing: the man on the other side of the channel. To understand how close Britain came to not surviving the Second World War, you have to go back to a single room in Whitehall in late May 1940. Not to the battlefield, not to the skies over Kent, to a cabinet room. Because the question of whether Britain would fight or surrender was not decided by soldiers or airmen in the summer of 1940. It was decided by 5 men sitting around a table in London in the last days of May, while the British Army was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk and France was collapsing around them. Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the same day Germany launched its invasion of France and the Low Countries. He had not been the obvious choice. He had not been the preferred choice of the king, or of most of the Conservative Party establishment, or of the outgoing Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who recommended someone else entirely. Churchill was 65 years old, widely regarded as a political liability, a man whose judgment had been questioned throughout the 1930s, even as he warned repeatedly and with increasing desperation about the threat that Hitler represented. He had been right about Hitler for a decade, while the political establishment around him had been wrong. And now that the catastrophe he had predicted had arrived, they gave him the job of dealing with it almost by default, because the man they actually wanted, Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, had quietly declined. Churchill took the job he had wanted his entire life at the worst possible moment in British history. Within days of taking power, he was sitting in that cabinet room facing a proposal from Lord Halifax that history has largely forgotten but which, if it had succeeded, would have changed everything. Halifax argued, with a careful diplomat's logic, that Britain should approach Mussolini. Italy had not yet entered the war, and explore whether terms could be negotiated with Hitler through Italian mediation. The terms Halifax had in mind were not humiliating capitulation. Then France fell. On the 22nd of June 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany, the country that had been Britain's closest ally, the country whose army had been the largest in the world, the country on whose soil the First World War had been decided. France surrendered in the same railway carriage at Compiègne where Germany had surrendered in 1918, in a deliberate act of humiliation staged by Hitler personally. Britain was now entirely alone. There was not a single Allied army left on the European continent. There was not a single government left in Western Europe that was still fighting. Britain was the last, and Germany began making plans to finish it. Hitler's invasion plan for Britain was called Operation Sea Lion. It required the German army to cross the English Channel and land on the southern coast of England with enough force to overwhelm whatever resistance remained. The plan had one absolute prerequisite. Before any invasion fleet could cross the channel under the guns of the Royal Navy, Germany had to control the skies above it. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had to destroy the Royal Air Force's fighter command. Without air superiority, Sea Lion was impossible. And so on the 10th of July 1940, the Battle of Britain began. What followed across the summer and autumn of 1940 was one of the most consequential military campaigns in the history of the world. It was fought almost entirely in the air, above the fields and towns of southern England, by men so young that some of them had barely learned to shave. The Royal Air Force Fighter Command was desperately outnumbered. The Luftwaffe had roughly 2,600 aircraft committed to the campaign. Fighter Command had around 600 operational aircraft at any given time. Spitfires and Hurricanes, the two great fighter planes whose names became synonymous with the survival of Britain itself. The German plan was to destroy Fighter Command, its airfields, its radar stations, its factories, and above all its pilots, in sufficient numbers and at sufficient speed that the RAF would cease to function as an effective defensive force within weeks. For a period in late August and early September 1940, it was working. Fighter Command was losing pilots and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. The airfields in the south of England were being bombed so consistently and so effectively that operations were becoming difficult to sustain. The men flying those aircraft were flying 4, 5, 6 sorties a day, exhausted beyond the point where exhaustion is a useful word for the condition, knowing that every time they climbed into the cockpit, the statistical probability of surviving another week was diminishing. Churchill stood in the House of Commons on August the 20th and said of those men something that has never been improved upon as a description of what they were doing and what it cost. He said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Then Germany made the mistake that saved Britain. On the 7th of September 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its targeting. Instead of continuing to bomb RAF airfields, which was destroying Fighter Command from below, it turned its attention to London. The reasons for this shift are debated by historians. The RAF had staged a bombing raid on Berlin in late August, infuriating Hitler, who reportedly demanded that the RAF be made to pay by bombing British cities. Whatever the exact calculus, the decision was a strategic catastrophe for Germany. By bombing London instead of the airfields, the Luftwaffe gave Fighter Command exactly what it needed most. Time. Time to repair the airfields. Time to bring pilots back from rest. Time to receive new aircraft from the factories. Time to recover from the attrition that had been grinding it toward collapse. The Blitz, the sustained bombing of London and other British cities that followed, was a genuine horror. Between September 1940 and May 1941, German bombers attacked London for 57 consecutive nights. 43,000 British civilians were killed. 1 million homes were damaged or destroyed. The East End of London was set ablaze in fires that burned for days. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Families slept in underground stations. St. Paul's Cathedral stood surrounded by smoke and flame in photographs that became among the most famous images of the entire war. The Great Dome emerging from the destruction as a symbol of defiance so powerful that Churchill reportedly said it must not be allowed to fall. And yet the Blitz failed to break British morale. The population did not surrender to terror. They did not demand that the government negotiate. They endured. By mid-September 1940, the turning point had been reached. The RAF was shooting down German bombers faster than German industry could build them. The pilots who had been flying on the edge of physical and psychological collapse through August had been given enough time to recover. Fighter Command had demonstrated something that the German High Command had not believed possible, that the Luftwaffe could not achieve air superiority over Britain. Without air superiority, Sea Lion was impossible. On the 19th of September, Hitler ordered the invasion barges that had been assembled in the Channel ports to be dispersed. Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. It was never revived. Britain had survived. The full weight of what that survival meant would only become clear in the years that followed. Because the survival of Britain in 1940 was not merely the survival of an island nation. It was the preservation of the only base from which the eventual liberation of Europe could be launched. It was the preservation of the only territory from which American forces, when they finally entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, could operate in the European theater. The D-Day landings of June 1944, the operation that broke the back of German occupation in Western Europe, were launched from British soil, planned in British headquarters, supplied through British ports. If Britain had fallen in 1940, or if Churchill had accepted Halifax's proposal and negotiated a settlement, there is no base. There are no D-Day landings. The war in Europe ends on German terms. What that world looks like, a continent under permanent Nazi domination, with no power remaining in the West capable of contesting it, is a question that history, thankfully, does not require us to answer from experience. Churchill understood that he was not fighting for Britain alone. He said it in June 1940, standing in the House of Commons with France collapsing and his army trapped on a beach, in the speech in which he used the phrase that defined the entire year. He said that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth lasted for 1,000 years, men would still say this was their finest hour. He was speaking to the British people, but he was also speaking to history. He was telling the future what the present was being asked to carry. Britain survived the darkest war not because it was invincible. It survived because at the precise moment when the sensible course was to stop fighting, one man in a cabinet room refused. Because 338,000 men were pulled off a beach by a civilian fleet and lived to fight again. Because a few hundred pilots flew until they could barely stand and held the sky above an island that the rest of the world had already written off. They held it. And the world that exists today, the world where Nazi Germany is history and not geography, exists because they did.